Hi, and welcome to our podcast from the Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning at the University of Delaware. I'm Rose Moravchik, the Assistant Director of CTAL, Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning, and I'm joined by one of my colleagues today.
I'm Kevin Guidry, the Associate Director for Educational Assessment. Hey, we really need a title and a theme song for this podcast someday.
Yeah, someone should, with any comments or suggestions for titles and theme songs, go ahead and send us an email at ctal-info@udel.edu.
It's our high priority.
We're happy to receive that. We're here today to talk about our most recent and first Friday roundtable of the semester. Our title was, Why Don't They Talk? And who's they, Kevin?
They is our students. So we're talking about classrooms and classroom community.
The reason for this particular topic at this particular time was this is a question we get asked all the time over in CTAL. Why don't my students talk? They don't want to participate. But we combined that with a topic that is always important at the beginning of the semester, and that is creating a classroom community and that feeling of belonging for students. It also is the case that the research tells us there's a connection between these two things. And if you create a supportive classroom community, your students are much more likely to be active participants in that classroom. So we had 3 objectives. We'll go over them really quick, and then we'll delve into our discussion. We started off by describing some of the connections between community and active participation. Then we had our participants define what participation means for them as instructors in their courses. And then we had a conversation about some new strategies that they might employ for getting their students to talk in class.
And in this roundtable, we try to model what it is that we're talking about. I mean, it's what we try to do. We feel we have a strong obligation, we feel, as faculty developers to try to model effective teaching and what the research shows us is effective. So what we tried to do are a couple things. One, we allowed the participants to select some of the topics of discussion. In particular, we didn't have time to talk about every possible strategy, or even, quite frankly, more than just a couple. Yeah. So we asked them to vote on which strategy do they want to focus on, and that's what we focused on. Quick writes, by the way, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
We had 3 choices that I offer. I phrased it as choose your own adventure. That's a reference to a classic series of young adult literature. I think 1979 to 1983 was the original run, and now I've dated myself. But what we did was we offered them a choice between quick writes, talking about conflict in the classroom, and what was the third? Oh, and creating ground rules for classroom discussion. So like Kevin said, we want to model, and what this does for a class is gives your students some agency over what happens in the classroom because they got to vote, they got to choose.
Yeah, so it gives students a sense of ownership and a sense of them choosing the direction. It's the same kind of idea behind things like problem-based learning or some other pedagogies where you allow students some level of control over the class themselves and over the goals. And they're not that you're giving up all of your control and ownership. You're just giving students some of that control so that they know where they're going and, more importantly, why they're going there.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of the themes of how we modeled the workshop was giving up that little bit of control, but not all of it. So the first part of our workshop was getting our participants to talk about what community means for them. And for this, we modeled a strategy that's sometimes called decentering or taking away the front of the room, where the facilitator, which in this case was me, was not the person calling on everybody. So I asked folks to come up with some ideas about what community might mean, and they had to introduce themselves, say their name, and then when they were finished making their comment, they called on the next person in the room. And how do we think that went, Kevin?
I think it went well, but it's a strange place for a faculty member to be. I think that for many of us, our experience of education throughout almost all of our lives is that there's a teacher and the teacher is control, and the teacher calls on people, and after somebody's spoken, the teacher then responds to that, and then the teacher calls on someone else, and then the teacher responds to that person as well. So the teacher,
and then class is over. That's it.
Yeah. So the teacher is very much the center of focus of attention throughout most of it, and controls the flow of conversation and the flow of everything in the class. That's what a teacher does, right?
Right. I mean, that's what we're used to. So we tried to let faculty experience what this is like on the student side, and like all these strategies for supporting and creating community, you have to explain to students why you're doing it, and then be consistent and keep using these tactics. The first couple times might feel weird. It might not be what students expect, not what you expect, but eventually you're developing a space where the validation isn't coming from you, the instructor, but it's coming from their peers. And that's when you've created a community environment that's really conducive to a lot of active participation.
And when we asked the participants to define community or give us some sense of what they think, They said the things that I think we would expect. Things about there's an established culture, that there's a sense of team building and communication, there's a sense of safety and belonging and caring for one another, shared responsibility. And what I like most, there's a sense of some shared ground rules and some kind of cultural norms that are starting to be built or that exist in the community.
And we use that to pivot into having faculty talk about what participation means in terms of their own approach to teaching and their own courses. So the mode for this was a quick write, and that's basically what we focused on for the rest of the session in terms of a strategy. What we had them do was take 3 minutes to write down quietly what participation means for them. And then we moved from that writing into a small group discussion. So we had many tables of people from different disciplines, different kinds of courses, sharing what they had written down about what participation meant for them. And we got a lot of really interesting definitions.
Most of the really good definitions that we heard would relate back to what are the purposes of the course itself. So every course is going to have some different objectives that are there. That's what one of the things that distinguishes courses from one another is they have different outcomes that they're trying to establish. And participation should be defined relative to those outcomes.
That's something that came up time and time again in our questions as well, where folks were saying, well, my class does this, I have a large science class and I want students to become familiar with disciplinary modes of communication. Okay, now you've given us a really important framework for how you're going to conduct that discussion. It's not a free-for-all. It's not that you want to hear everybody's voice. It's that you have a goal, a reason for why you're having them speak in class.
And it's not just you've defined the goal, but then you've also started to work towards, so how do I, particularly if I'm actually awarding credit for this, if students' grades have some component that is participation, well, then that tells me as the instructor how I should go about that. It's not always the case, or maybe actually rarely the case, that the goal is just to have everybody talk and just say
right.
something. And we want them to say a particular set of somethings, and usually we want them to say it in a particular way. For example, we may want them to be using evidence in a particular way.
We had a sort of framework to this conversation about participation in community, which comes out of some research on why students do or do not feel comfortable participating in discussion. The one study that we looked at had to do with freshmen in a seminar course that had a large emphasis on discussion. And I gave 3 examples of reasons why students specifically said they didn't participate. And that helped us frame some of our discussion. So the first one was that students said the instructor had little notes that he went over and, quote, reads them out. Most of the time, it's him talking. And this was the case where an instructor had an agenda, had not really created space or a moment for students to actively engage with that agenda that led to a lack of discussion. The second example we had comes from a study about culturally responsive teaching, where a student addressed the dual issue of being a visible minority in a classroom and also feeling anxious about not wanting to say anything because he didn't know what was, quote unquote, going on. That fear of not knowing what's happening and not wanting to look stupid in front of your peers, which I think is a common feeling a lot of students and honestly some faculty feel too.
Yeah, so we need to be cognizant of what kind of participation we are expecting and how that actually matches with the way that we teach and how we've set up the class, what kind of community that we've built. If we are expecting only particular answers, if we're asking questions that we're fishing for an answer and there's going to be no discussion with that, and we're not open to any sort of veering off in different directions, and we need to understand that that's going to have a pretty severe impact on the nature and the manner of students participating.
Right. I think that giving up the control or feeling like you're giving up the control of that discussion is scary for faculty members because we want to be able to help students move towards a goal we've set and an objective, but too much control over the classroom, too much micromanaging of those questions is a real impediment to getting them talking in the first place. The final example of that we talked about for why students might not speak is because of controversial topics or the desire not to offend classmates. So in this case, the reading material was the Bible, and a student said that they didn't want to say anything that would upset anybody. So that's the avoidance of conflict and this desire to keep emotional reactions to controversial subjects out of a classroom discussion.
Right, so we need to model how we approach these topics within our discipline. So we don't shy away from these controversial topics. We approach them, but we approach them in a particular way based on the norms of our discipline, the way that our particular discipline agrees on evidence. What kinds of evidence are appropriate? What kinds of arguments can and cannot be made, or can and cannot be supported by evidence? So we need to model that for students, and we need to steer them in that direction whenever they offer comments. And sometimes that can be done best by asking metacognitive questions. So asking them questions about their questions, their comments. Things like, so why do you say that? Where do you get that from? How do you define that term? What do you mean by that? Getting them to think about, and not just think about, but actually communicate kind of why they're saying the things that they're saying. You can use that as a method to try to steer them in the direction that is productive for your class.
And you can model that too. As you are trying to introduce something, you can talk about where the source for that definition comes from, where that framework comes from. We had a great suggestion from a colleague about what they do where they introduce a straw person, so a not real person. Imagine someone who says X, right? And then have students respond to that. We also had a colleague who teaches really controversial topics and said that she has students always apply the theoretical lens. So they've read a theorist about a controversial topic, and then she'll say, well, what would this theorist say in this situation? That's disciplinary thinking, and that's getting students to engage with that controversial topic in a way that advances also their understanding of the theoretical concept.
But in any case, I think what distinguishes these faculty who do this really well is they've got some sort of plan, they've got an idea, and then they've got other plans about, like contingency plans.
Yeah.
So kind of thing, well, this could happen. If this happens, then I could react in this way. So it's probably no different than planning in other situations, except this one's a little bit unpredictable. So you think about kind of the, how things could go and what you might do in that situation.
And you develop kind of a toolkit. We talked about quick writes as being a part of that toolkit. Really quickly, the way that our faculty members talked about how to use this in their classes would be exactly in the way that we did. So writing for a couple of minutes, then a small group, then a large group. But you could also have students do one of these quick writes in a much larger class and collect those responses yourself as the instructor and use those to pull your own discussion questions either for the next session or for part of that session. So the size of your class also does not have to be a limiting factor in using one of those solutions. We have so many more things we could talk about when it comes to stimulating class discussion.
We like discussing discussions.
We could discuss discussion forever, but we'll end the podcast here by making a couple of plugs. The first is, if you still have questions about how to get your students to engage in this discussion, come visit us. We are always happy to have consultations. Our main office is 212 Gore Hall. We have resources tailor-made for you, your discipline, and all the challenges you might be facing. Where else can folks find us, Kevin?
We also hang out over in the Faculty Commons over in Pearson Hall 116. We're usually here Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons with our laptops waiting for you to come by because we want to help you.
And we're happy to talk about any other teaching questions you have. We'd welcome you at our next event. If you're listening to this relatively soon after the first Friday, the second First Friday is happening. When's Kevin, you have all the details?
Yeah, so that'll be in October. And the first Friday in October is October 6th. And again, these events happen from 3:30 to 5 on these Friday afternoons. They're over in Gore Hall in 212. No, not 212. That's where we work.
208.
Across the hall from where we work.
Right across.
And the topic of this roundtable will be how do I help undergraduate students be successful at UD? So I think a lot of this is going to be focused on student advising and some of the really cool tools that we have that we've been developing and purchasing and customizing for UD to help advisors work with students.
So thanks for listening, and we are serious about suggesting potential titles and theme songs for our podcast. You can email us for a request for a consultation.
Live demonstrations would be appropriate. We welcome that.
Yes, you can always email us with your exciting new suggestions for our podcast at CTAL.
Serenade us outside our window.
CTAL-info@udel.edu. Thanks very much.